So it's my pleasure to introduce Eleanor Sterling, who is the Jaffe Chief Conservation Scientist at the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation at the American Museum of Natural History. Dr. Sterling is passionate about the intersection between biodiversity, culture, and languages. She works to strengthen connections between people and place, across communities, and through time. She has interdisciplinary training in biological and social sciences and has over 30 years of field research and community outreach experience with direct application to biodiversity conservation in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Oceania. Eleanor's worked all over the world. She believes in addressing problems from a systems perspective, understanding root causes and motivations, and identifying key leverage points. She has a lifelong fascination with languages and has studied over 10 languages, from Vietnamese to Swahili. She is also a world authority on the an unusual nocturnal lemur endemic to Madagascar, and she lived in a tent for 2 years on an uninhabited island in Madagascar to study this fascinating animal. She has a long history of engagement on equity and inclusion issues, and co-founded the Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity Committee of the Society for Conservation Biology, as well as the Women in Natural Sciences New York chapter of the Association for Women in Science. So it's my great pleasure to welcome her up here.
I'm pretty excited it was somebody else's job to make that work, and that it worked. I'm a little bit shy, so it's nicer to have the slides instead of trying to speak extemporaneously. So today I'm going to talk to you really quickly about two projects that I'm doing. One as part of the American Museum of Natural History I work, and another as part of the Women in Natural Sciences chapter of the American Association for Women in Sciences that I helped to co-found here in New York City. And the first one I'm going to talk to you about is thinking about measuring indicators of well-being and sustainability. As I mentioned, that's part of the work that I do at the American Museum of Natural History. I work for the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation, where we transform knowledge from multiple sources into action. And we do that through 3 different areas in applied research. So everything that we do in research, we think about how that can be applied to some kind of a conservation decision or action, developing capacity for conservation, and then convening and connecting, because we feel it's fundamental for us to share our experiences and learn from each other, and that's how we really advance in problem solving. So the project that I'm going to talk to you briefly about today is research that we're doing on indicators of well-being focused in on the Pacific. And why did we choose the Pacific to think about these ideas of how do we measure success? And it's because people across the Pacific have faced incredible amounts of change, of social change, of change in relation to major weather events, tsunamis, earthquakes, and they really have adapted to and found ways to become resilient in the face of these massive changes. That being said, some of the changes they're facing now are much, much bigger than before. That climate change and other things are really causing sudden changes and unpredictable changes, and sea level rise, as we know, ocean acidification, and droughts and storms that they're not really used to. And then there's also simultaneously massive population growth in many of these areas, and the impact of market economies on people's lives is significantly changing how people live and what they value. And so one of the outcomes, unfortunately, of this may be that people who currently depend on agriculture and fisheries for their livelihoods may not be able to depend on that food as early as 2020. So we, oh, this is an old presentation, but that's okay. I'll figure it out. Wow, this is a really old one. I guess there's no way to use the one that was on the Dropbox now? Okay. We work on indicators because we think that these indicators can help people to understand what is important to, what does success look like to people across the world. And we try to figure out how to adapt to this old version of the presentation. And we feel that it's really important for our people to think about how do they communicate about what success looks like, how do they communicate about what is important to them. And the reasons that we do that is because people around the world have very different ways of sharing information about what a healthy, happy system looks like. And one of the consequences of thinking about that is that we recognize that people in the international arena who are trying to do good, who think about things like sustainable development goals and what are called Aichi targets that relate to the Convention on Biological Diversity, they measure things that are easy to measure. They measure things like gross national product. They measure money. They measure how many television sets people have. They measure how many boats people have. And those are, of course, important at some level to people around the world, but there's a whole value space of things that are really, really important to local communities that are missing in those areas. We've done a lot of work across the Pacific asking people what contributes to the good life in your community. And they talk about connection to place, connection to people, people working together for the greater good. Not a single one of those things is measured in the international metrics. And those are the things that people often point to first. And $1.25 a day, which is what people focus in on a lot in the international arena in terms of poverty alleviation and other things, is a meaningless metric for a lot of these folks for so many reasons. So we're really interested in how do we ground indicators in local systems? How do we find ways to not just rely on those easy to measure indicators, but to think about how we can capture links between land, sea, and people, and work to harmonize what happens on the local level and what we're measuring at the international level. Couple of examples of how this manifests on the ground. If a lot of people are very, very interested in food security, and of course that's a really important and fundamental thing for people all around the world, the international metrics for identifying if people are doing well in food security measure if people are vulnerable. They measure if they ask questions like, were you ever hungry but you didn't eat because you didn't have enough food? Or did your children skip meals because you didn't have enough food? Or did you have to beg from your neighbor because you didn't have enough food? Or did you borrow from your neighbor? And these are negative things. If you did any of these things, it's not a great thing. When we work in the Pacific, if you say hello in Fiji, you say, come in and eat. That's how you say hello. You don't really expect everybody who walks by your house to come in and eat at your house. But the idea is, I have sufficient food. If you need it, I'm offering it to you. So if you ask people, did you beg for food, or borrowing food is bad, or worse, were you hungry because you could not feed your children? It's like asking somebody, how many times did you poison your child this week? It's a really fundamentally negative, reinforcing vulnerability set of vision. It's a fast way to get at, is there a problem? Oh my gosh, how wonderful, you are amazing. And instead what we're trying to do is think about resilience. What exists within a system that's working? What can we reinforce of those systems? How can we ask questions that remind people that they're doing pretty well, and maybe they could do better based on what they're already doing well? So this is an example of why we're focusing in on indicators, because we think it's fundamental to be asking a question that allows people to thank you guys so much. What's the average length of time for which households in the community have a culturally valued food supply after disaster? This is getting us away from, oh my gosh, there was a disaster, let's just feed you rice and ramen. Oh, you have diabetes? Well, too bad, we'll figure out some other way of dealing with that in the future, but there's an emergency. This is thinking about what do people want to eat, what's nutritionally important for them, and then where are the sources of knowledge about where emergency foods are? There are a lot of places that have these alternative systems for finding food, and how can we reinforce that? A quick second example of issues are people around the world think, well, we're going to have problems with people having access to enough fisheries, so let's put in something called a fish aggregation device, which is allowing fish to be attracted to a particular place, and lots of fish come into the same place. And people can fish and get a lot of fish in a short period of time. Sounds really great, and people keep putting them in over and over again. But when we talk to people on the ground about what happens with those devices is that the men are the fisher people. They love to fish. They usually don't invest a huge amount of time in fishing because they don't always get a lot of fish. So they balance their time between working in the garden and going fishing. If they know they're always going to get fish every single time they go out, they're going to go to this fish attracted device. What does that do? Men get a lot of fish. They sell the fish. They do not use the money that they sell necessarily for the families. And they're not working in the garden anymore. So the women are actually facing the problem of keeping up with gardening in a way that they couldn't do, in a way they're not able to, because suddenly there's a breakdown in the structure of relationships. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to work on locally designed indicators, understanding what's relevant and important to local communities. Quick example of this is the work that we've been doing in the Solomon Islands, which is in the Western Pacific, where we're working with 4 different communities to understand what do they value, what are their connections between people and place, how would they tell the world how things are doing, and what they wish they could do better. We use visual arts techniques to understand and reveal some of these priorities, in part because people share information traditionally through art, through songs, through the spoken word, rather than some of the written methods that people have used in the past to understand this. We're exploring the future through scenario planning to help us understand what do people value, what do they have now, and what do they wish they could have into the future. We're focusing in on things that are important to them, that they have said are important to them, such as the changing diets. And on the left-hand side is the breakfast that they're eating now, which is very, very high in sugar, and the breakfast that they would like to eat. We're trying to understand why are they not eating those things. There are people in the room who've been doing this work, Georgina Cullman and others, whose work I'm representing. I did say that in the first slide. I'm sorry to say this isn't just my work, but it's a number of people, of teams working together. One of the things the community's noted as an indicator of something that's a challenge for them is that they have an increasing amount of pests. They're very, very dependent on sweet potatoes, and the sweet potato food source is challenged by this increase in these leaf rollers that essentially kill the plant or stunt the plant so that it doesn't provide enough resources. So the community is out there working with us to try to understand why, when, and how are these sweet potatoes showing up, and how can we try to piece that together. And the work that Georgina Cullman and others have been doing is showing that community experts, women, have been concerned about some changes in their foodways. There's a rise in non-communicable diseases such as gout, obesity, stunting, gout and obesity, gout and diabetes. And there's a loss of knowledge in food traditions and a decrease in the transfer of these traditions to children. They're thinking about what they think some of the drivers of those changes are, such as the decline in productivity of gardens in part because of these pests. There's overharvesting of resources, there's population growth, and then inadequate food production to meet those that growth. They're changing gender roles around the gardens, and their time constraints. We've also engaged with experts in the Solomon Islands to think about what do the nutrition, the Department of Public Health and others consider challenges that the communities are facing. And they have a double burden of malnutrition where the children under 5 are undernourished, and then a large percentage of women and men are overweight or obese. And so in order to understand what we can do about that, we did a suite of work to try to piece together what people are eating, how are they cooking. And the women on the right-hand side of this said that they felt that there wasn't this transmission of knowledge, and they missed the foods that their mothers made. And so what they decided to do is to come together and develop a cookbook from across 4 of these multiple sites in the communities. And what they did was they said, what are the recipes that my mother fed me that are no longer available? And they pieced together this amazing, gorgeous book. I'm happy to show it to anybody who's interested. I'm just so amazed by it. For how do you collect the food? How do you prepare it? What do you do with it? How do you eat it? We also have nutritional advice that comes from specialists in the nutritional arena after we assess their diets. And overall, it's just really helping to pass on the knowledge to the next generation. And you can see when the book went back to the community, there was just incredible enthusiasm and interest. And in fact, we're looking for resources to publish another run so that they can actually sell this in the local hotels and then continue to reinforce the women's groups in the communities. We're doing the same thing with plant books, which has been, this is one of my favorite pictures. This guy has a t-shirt that's in the shape of overalls. And they're looking, you can't really see it here, but they're looking at an iPad where they're reviewing the book before it gets finalized. But this is a book of the medicinal plants. And so this takes me to the last quick thing that I wanted to talk about, which is that these stories are at present all around the world of people who are doing amazing things for conservation, for their livelihoods. And the second project I wanted to tell you about that's I'm running under the Women in Natural Sciences guise is the Untold Stories in Natural History and Conservation project, where we're trying to piece together stories from all around the world, through time, from the past through to the present, of people who are doing amazing things for natural history and conservation, founders of the New York Botanical Garden who are women expedition leaders, and getting the word out and letting them tell their own stories to improve the lives of everybody around the world. These are just 2 examples, Ray Wynn Grant and Cynthia Malone, who are both biodiversity conservation specialists. And another set of examples is people working on diversified farming from all around the world. So I'm happy to share more about that. I think I just ran out of time. And I just wanted to, I think we have a few minutes for questions, but thank you so much for listening.